Thank you, Dr. Lasker, for joining us today. Dr. Lasker is the Norbert Blechner Professor Emeritus of Jewish Values at the Ben Gurion University of the Negev. He has all of his academic degrees from Brandeis University. He has written and edited many books, and has taught at schools like the University of Toronto, Yale, Princeton, University of Washington, and Yeshiva University, among many others. He has done a lot of work in the field of Jewish philosophy, and of course is an expert on Karaite Judaism, which is what he is here to teach about. We're, of course, very fortunate to have you here. Thank you, Dr. Lasker. You can take it away.
Okay. Thank you very much, Maxine. I'm very happy to be here. Many, many years ago, I gave a number of talks for Torah in Motion in Toronto itself. I'm sort of sorry I'm not there right now. I'm just doing on Zoom, but I understand that one can get a much larger audience on the Zoom. In any event, I thank Torah in Motion, Rabbi Kelman, for inviting me again. It's an opportunity to talk about Karaism, which is a subject which is not well known. And it's also an opportunity to show off my book, this new book. I think it looks backwards for me at least, it looks backwards. It's called Karaism, an introduction to the older surviving alternative Judaism. So someone asked about source sheets. I don't have any for the lecture, but anybody is more than welcome to get this book, and has most of the information that I'll be talking about today and the next 2 weeks. So first of all, what is Karaism? And before I get to answer that question, I'd like to start off with what's the Judaism with which we're all familiar. Now that Judaism is known as Rabbinic Judaism. It's called Rabbinic Judaism because it was the product of the work of the people we call the rabbis, not small r rabbis, but big R rabbis, capital R rabbis, the group of Jewish scholars from the last few before the Common Era centuries until the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries of the Common Era. And it's their work which formed Judaism and is recorded in rabbinic literature, which we know mostly as the Mishnah and the Talmud. And we call this rabbinic literature, we call this rabbinic Judaism because the way we observe, most Jews observe the commandments or their approach to Judaism is through rabbinic literature. Now, this literature interprets the Hebrew Bible and basically decides and makes a decision as to how the Bible should be understood. And we follow the laws as outlined in this literature, basically the Talmud. According to the rabbis, they didn't make up this religion. They were just transmitting what was revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai, both in the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, which were actually written, and the oral Torah, which was then eventually written down in the rabbinic literature. So the rabbinic Judaism is the rabbinic Judaism that most Jews follow. When I recently wrote an article which I said something about majority of Jews follow rabbinic literature and rabbinic Judaism, and some reader commented, but no, most Jews don't observe Judaism at all. But that's not really true, because anybody who does anything, I'd say most everyone who does anything that's Jewish does it within the rabbinic context. Anybody who has a Passover Seder has it on the day of the year, which is designated in the rabbinic calendar, the Rabbinic calendar, not the Karaite calendar, or not the Dead Sea Scroll calendar, or not the Christian calendar. They do it according to the rabbinic Jewish calendar. Anybody observes Hanukkah, they observe a holiday which was instituted by the rabbis. Anybody who even talks about Tikkun Olam, this is a rabbinic concept. So even though presumably there are Jews who are so assimilated they don't do anything, if that's possible, anybody or the vast majority of Jews who identify somehow with Judaism, do something Jewish, do it as part of Rabbinic Judaism. But there have been other Judaisms through the centuries. In the time of the Second Temple was destroyed 70 of the Common Era. There are many different religious Jewish groups, what I'd call today religious parties, on the Israeli model, each one trying to convince the majority of Jews that their take on Judaism was the correct take. We have the Dead Sea Scroll people, we have the Sadducees. Eventually, you have the Christians who then left Judaism, and I won't get into that discussion at all. So we have had other Judaisms, but the one that has survived the longest is the one called Karaism. Now, Karaism, Karaut in Hebrew, or B'nai Mikra, the Karaites, the Karaim, or the children of Scripture, follow Mikra, Scripture. And that's generally accepted as the reason why they're called Karaites, that they follow Mikra, Scripture. However, many people think that makes them scripturalists, meaning that they follow what it says in the Bible literally. And if I succeed in anything, this lecture series, I hope to disabuse people of much of what's called popular wisdom about charism. It's the little people know about charism is usually wrong in many respects. So Karaites are not strict literalists, and we'll talk about it next week when I talk about their practice, but they claim to follow the written Torah, and they say that there was no divine oral Torah. And as a result of this difference, the Karaites developed an alternative Judaism, a religion which is very much like Rabbinic Judaism, but it's different. And except, as we'll talk about later in today's talk, most Karaites saw themselves as part of the Jewish people, and most other Jews saw Karaites as part of the Jewish people. So they're part of the Jewish people. They're observing a religion based on the Hebrew Bible. They do many things that look very similar to what Rabbinic Jews do, what we call in this context Rabbinites. But ultimately, it's an alternative Judaism. It's a different Judaism. It's a Judaism which has different choices and different observances. So what I'm going to try to do is, in these 3 weeks, discuss Karaism, both the history, today will be the history and the origins. Next week, what Karaites actually do, in other words, what makes them different and what they believe. And the third week, Karaite intellectual accomplishments. Why should Rabbinic Jews, Rabbinites be interested in this group? What did they ever do for us? And I'd like to show that they did many things for the Jewish people, and their intellectual accomplishments had a great influence on the rest of the Jewish people and their accomplishments. Okay, so let's start with history. If you ask any Jew who knows something about Jewish history and says, who are the Karaites? The name they'll throw out is Anan ben David. Anan ben David was a Babylonian or Iraqi Jew in the 8th century. And according to the story told by his opponents, and the story was told it was recorded many years later, so we don't know who exactly told the story and when he told the story. But according to this story, and this is the famous story, Anan was a candidate to be the exilarch in Iraq. The Jewish community in Iraq, Babylonia, had a religious leadership, and it also had secular civil leadership. I often say that the exilarch was like the chairman of the council of the committee of major Jewish organizations in Iraq. So Anan wanted this job. It was a very prestigious job, but he was passed over by his younger brother, Hananiah, mostly according to the story, because the rabbis had suspicions about him. So Anan says, okay, you're not going to appoint me exilarch, I'll appoint myself exilarch. And he started saying, I'm the exilarch also. Now, the Jews had a certain amount of autonomy in Iraq, but not full autonomy. and their position of exilarch had to be approved by the caliph, the leader of the Muslims. Well, the caliph had approved Anan's brother Hanania, and when he heard that Anan was playing exilarch on his own, he arrested Anan, sentenced him to death, put him in jail to wait for his death sentence. So poor Anan starts talking to one of his cellmates, a Muslim, and, as I say, what are you in for? What are you in for? So Anan tells his Muslim roommate or cellmate that he's there because he contested the exilarchate, to be exilarch. So the Muslim says to him, well, look, does your religion have different interpretations of different laws? And Anan says, yes. So he says, well, look, go bribe the vizier to get an appointment with the caliph and tell the caliph that you are a different religion. You don't have the same religion as your brother, but a different religion. So this is what Anan does. He talks to the caliph. He convinces him that he has a different religion. And not only that, he says his religion is closer to the caliph's religion, because in his religion, the calendar is set by observation of astronomical phenomena, just like the Islamic calendar. And by the way, as you probably know, the Muslims to this day use actual observation of the moon to determine when the moon months begin. So even a day or two before the major holidays, they don't know what day the holidays are going to be on because they have to see they observe the moon. In any event, Anan tells the caliph this. He tells his followers that Elijah the prophet had revealed himself to Anan and said that the way he was observing Judaism was wrong, and they'd have to do it a different way. So the caliph releases Anan, and then Anan has a certain problem, which is he promised the caliph a different religion, and suddenly he has to make up a religion. And according to the story, this is what he does. He gathers around some ne'er-do-wells, leftovers from the Second Temple sectarianism, and sets up a new religion. This is the standard Rabbinite story of the founding of Karaism. And it fits in well with Rabbinic or Rabbinite theology and historiography. What I mean by that is, according to the rabbis, we have one Judaism of two Torahs, written in an oral Torah, which was given on Mount Sinai and has remained unchanged for the last 3,500 years or so, and will remain unchanged until the coming of the Messiah. The fact that there are other types of Judaism in the history was because that they were for non-honest or dishonest reasons. So if you look at the story of how the Sadducees began, you had two students in the rabbinic period, the Sadok and Baitus, and they were in class listening to their teacher, and they misunderstood what their teacher was saying. Undoubtedly, they were playing with Facebook or sending messages with each other or whatever they do in class then. And therefore, they set up a religion called Sadduceeism or Boetheism. Didn't survive past the Second Temple that we know of, but that this is why they left. Why did Christians leave Judaism? Because this guy thought he was Messiah, and he convinced his followers there's a Messiah. And we have other examples of different Judaisms where the assumption is that they left Rabbinic Judaism. So this story about Anan fits in well with the traditional Rabbinic idea of history. It's all great, except the story has a lot of questionable parts of it. Let me put it that way. Besides not knowing exactly who told it and where he got it from, the story says that Anan was not appointed to be exilarch because they doubted his religiosity or his reliability, that already they thought he had heretical tendencies. So it's not he became a heretic when he wasn't given the exilarchate. Apparently he already was questionable. And if you're in jail with a Muslim and saying your problem is that I say I'm an exilarch, Why didn't the Muslims say to him, well, convert to Islam, and that way you'll get out of it? And in fact, the story, a later story, identifies this Muslim with a particular expert in Muslim law who indeed was executed in the year 767 Common Era. And then when asked, well, he could give good advice to Anan to get out of jail, but he himself was executed. Also, you'd expect from this story that Anan be a power-hungry, power-grabbing person. But if you look at his laws and the number of things he does, he was very ascetic. He was against eating meat and drinking wine when there was no temple. He was not a person who was extolling wealth and televangelist, raising vast amounts of money. He apparently wasn't. He was apparently a very learned person, but he had a different form of Judaism. And according to the story, when he told the caliph that his Judaism was closer to the caliph's Islam, there are two examples. One was determining the new moon by observation, which is in Islam, but determining the leap years by observation of the crops. I'll talk about that next week. In Islam, there's no New Year's. There are no leap years. I'm sorry. There are no leap years in Islam. So that couldn't convince the caliph that it was close to his religion. In any event, what we know now from more texts that have been developed or have been discovered is that Anan's group were really called Ananites, Anania. He never called himself Karaites. His followers never called themselves Karaites. The Karaites themselves seem to have started in the 9th century. Anan was in the 8th century. It was only later that the Karaites identified Anan as one of their leaders, but at the time of Anan, there were no Karaites, and he founded a group called the Ananites who coalesced into Karaites and disappeared. Okay, so that's the Anan story, which doesn't seem to be very likely. What do the Karaites say? Well, the Karaites have a different issue. They say, we're not interested in when Karaism broke away from Rabbinic Judaism. Karaism was given on Mount Sinai. Karaism was given with a written Torah to Moses, and that's been the true Judaism for 3,500 years. So the real question is, how did Rabbinic Judaism, I assume most of the people listening today, how did we get a new religion? So the Karaites had a difficulty trying to figure this out. Some of them said it started with Jeroboam, Yerovam. This was the fellow from the northern kingdom of Israel who set up revolted against the son of Solomon and divided the kingdom of Jewish kingdom, if you can call it that, Israel kingdom, into northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And one of the things he's described in the Bible as doing is setting up a separate sanctuary or two separate sanctuaries so people wouldn't go to Jerusalem, and celebrating Sukkot tabernacles in the 8th month rather than the 7th month. So this seems to be, according to the Karaite writers, the beginning of a schism, the beginning of heresy, the beginning of two Judaisms. But what they really have said for the last 500 years or so is based on a story in the Talmud, which was reported by Judah Halevi, Rabbi Judah Halevi, the author of the Kuzari, who tells a story about how in the time of King Alexander Yanai, that's Hasmonean king, it's about 100 before the Common Era, he got very angry at the sages. They impugned his parentage, let me put it that way, and he didn't take that lying down, and he decided he wanted to get rid of all these sages. Some say kill, some say exile, but he talked to his friends and said to his friends, well, what are we going to do? I can't kill all the sages. Who's going to teach us Judaism? They said, don't worry about it. We have a written Torah and we can determine that on our own. So when the king exiled or killed all the real sages, there entered into Judaism, according to the story by Judah Halevi, this Judaism based on the written Torah. So the Karaites say, the story is true, but the real sages were the Karaites. And what happened was that one of the rabbinic sages who was exiled was a guy named Shimon ben Shetach. He went to Egypt. He invented a new religion called Rabbinic Judaism. And then he returned to the land of Israel and spread this new religion. Now, how was he so successful in spreading this religion? Well, first of all, the real sages had been killed. And second of all, he happened to be the king's brother-in-law. He was the queen's brother. So he had what in Israel is called protexia. And some people have the wrong idea about this idea of protexia, because we Israelis really know that as long as you know the right people, you don't really need protexia. So so he was able to spread this rabbinic Judaism. This became the majority. The Karaites were the small group called Tzaddikim, the righteous, or the proto-Karaites, and they maintained the correct traditions with the destruction of the temple, and they were loyal to the written Torah until in the 8th century, Anan revigorated things. In the 9th century, the few other leaders, Benjamin Nawandi, Daniel Akumisi, and they started, they didn't start Karaism, they revived Karaism. Karaism, again, goes back to the giving of the Torah. So to the question, how did Rabbinic Judaism develop? According to the Karaites, it was because of this event in the Second Temple period. In fact, a 15th century Karaite said, would that King Alexander Yanai have killed all the sages? Or would that Shimon ben Shetach had been killed also, then we'd still be one people. Now, this explanation, the Karaite explanation of the founding of Rabbinic Judaism, the separation of the two groups, is also very problematic. We have no indication that such groups existed. We have no literature between the Second Temple and the time of Anan. And of course, to say that the religion, the Judaism of Moses was Karaism, a little bit exaggerated, to say the least. So the problem before the historians is to try to understand or try to reconstruct what really happened. Now, I don't know if historians can reconstruct what really happened. Certainly those who try to do it have their own biases. And among those of us who study Karaism, I'd say each one of us has sort of a different idea about the origins. So even though there's no objective history as such, one could see what's liable, what's possible, what's the most reasonable explanation. So the one that I like is that there were far-flung Jewish communities. I mean, it's not like today that I can sit in Beersheba and see people sitting all over the world and giving a talk. These were communities which are at far distance from the centers in Iraq and Baghdad. And many of them had their own traditions, maybe old traditions, maybe going back to the times of the temple. And suddenly the Babylonian Gaonate, the Gaonim, or those are the religious heads of the Babylonians, the Iraqi Jews, started to try to impose their way and the Talmud on the whole Jewish people. Now, this also fits into what was going on in the Islamic world, that the caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate was in Baghdad. They were trying to get their hegemony over the whole Islamic world. So it made sense that the Gaonim were also competing for the Jewish people. And it's not unlikely that when they try to convince Jews from communities far away they should do things the way it is in the Talmud, those communities said, well, what are you talking about? This isn't how we do it. And it's interesting that in the 9th century, when Karaism develops, or people start calling themselves B'nai Mikra or Balei Mikra, the scripturalists, it's interesting that they didn't accept necessarily the fellowship, the heading of the Gonim. They didn't want the Gonim. They weren't willing necessarily to accept them, and it was during this period, the 9th century, where the names we know of Karaites are from Persia or Iran. So one of them is Benjamin al-Nahawendi, that's from Nahavend in Persia. The other one is Daniel al-Kumasi from Kumis in Persia. We have grammarians, Hebrew grammarians from Persia. So it's not unlikely that this is where these non-rabbinic groups got their inspiration. Another interesting question is that a number of these people from Anan and then Benjamin and other early Karaites wrote books of commandments. And a very interesting question is we don't know whether those books of commandments were prescriptive or descriptive. In other words, when Anan says, I'll take an example, that one isn't allowed to have fire in one's house on the Sabbath. So for Anan and then the Karaites afterwards, I'll talk about next week, on Friday night, there were no Friday night candles. There was no light in the house. There's no heating, use of fire. There's no cholent on Shabbos afternoon. And this is because they interpret the law in at the end of Exodus about not having fire on the Sabbath as meaning not it's forbidden to kindle, but it's forbidden to have any fire going at all during the Sabbath. So did Anan make this up and the Karaites make this up? Or was this a practice that Jews in their areas were following, and the people who wrote books of commandments, the Ephraim and Tzvot, just codified this law? So we don't really know. As I said, it's impossible to know whether Karaites made up stuff or just codified laws that already existed. Let me just add one more wrinkle or one more fly in the ointment, and that's the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1947, scrolls were found by the Dead Sea, and some people identified the content with being close to Karaism. And in fact, one of the compositions found there was something what we call the Damascus document, which was also found 50 years earlier in the Cairo Geniza. This is the repository of many, many manuscripts in Cairo, in the synagogue in Cairo. So you have a text which was previously unknown, which was found in a medieval copy in the Cairo Geniza in 1897, and in an ancient Second Temple copy, and many copies in Qumran by the Dead Sea and the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the question is, what is the relationship between the Dead Sea literature and the Karaites? So some people say there's a very close connection, that there's many of the same laws and the same rules. I'll give an example: having Shavuot always on a Sunday, or the prohibition of an aunt marrying a nephew. I'm sorry, an uncle marrying a niece. The Torah prohibits aunts marrying nephews. It doesn't prohibit uncles marrying nieces. In Rabbinic Judaism, that's allowed. In Karaism and also in the Dead Sea Scroll people, it's forbidden. And there are other examples. So some people think it's very close, and some people think just coincidence. But whatever the case, the issue is, was this an ongoing religious group from the Second Temple, from the Dead Sea Scroll people until the Middle Ages? Or is it possible, and we have evidence, someone, a Catholic, or sorry, the Catholicos, it's like a bishop of the Eastern Christians, records that around the year 800, Jews from Jerusalem went down to the Jericho area and found scrolls, and they brought them back to Jerusalem and started copying them. So we don't know if there's any relationship with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and if there is a relationship, perhaps it's just by happenstance that people found those scrolls. So half an hour into my talk, the answer is we don't know. And there's no definite way of determining how Karaism began. What we can do is talk about the history of this group. As I said, we have people, someone in the mid-9th century in Persia, Iraq, talking about Ba'alei Mikra, B'nai Mikra, the scripturalists. The end of the 9th century, we have a fellow called Daniel al-Qumasi, also from Persia, who moves to Jerusalem and encourages all other Jews to move to Jerusalem. In fact, he has a plan. He writes to the communities in the diaspora and says, I know there are people here who are unwilling to move. They can't give up their businesses. They don't want to, they're afraid to, whatever the conditions in Israel, etc. But every community should send 5 individuals, I assume families, men with families, and money to support them. In other words, this is like the first United Jewish Appeal, that the whole diaspora should give money to send Jews to Israel. And it's interesting that we sometimes say that the definition of a Zionist is one Jew who gives money to a second Jew to send a third Jew to Israel. But these Karaites were Zionists in the sense that they themselves moved to Israel. And we have the golden age of Karaism at this time. And it's during this time that Karaism turns into what it became. In the early 10th century, there is a Karaite in Iraq named Yaqub al-Kirkasani, who says that no 2 Karaites agree about anything, and the situation gets worse from day to day. Now, some people take this as proof that they're Jewish, but in any event, you can't really run a religion when 2 people agree on anything. Kirkasani was a contemporary of Rav Saadia Gaon. Rav Saadia Gaon was at least in the 10th century, the most important rabbinic Jewish leader. He revolutionized Judaism, and he's known for attacking Karaism. Now, this also is an interesting story because many people who study Jewish history, you'll read the books in history, write as if Rav Saadia Gaon was responsible single-handedly for stopping the Karaite menace. If Rav Saadia Gaon had not put his thumb in the dike to keep back the Karaite waves, we'd all be talking about some obscure little Jewish group that doesn't eat meat and milk together and has cholent on Shabbos. But according to, say, the traditional Jewish historiography, rabbinic Jewish historiography, Saadia defeated the Karaites. What's more likely is that there were different groups of Karaites or different anti-rabbinite groups. And when Saadia comes up and says, wait, you have to decide whether you're with us or with them, people had to get their acts together. And therefore, we see in the 10th and 11th centuries that there is a tremendous intellectual movement among Karaites. And it was during this period, and I'll talk about in the third week, where they developed their law, they developed their biblical commentaries, they developed their theology, they developed their Hebrew literature and grammar. So Saadia may have been more responsible for uniting the Karaites than separating them, and or defeating them, rather, uniting the Karaites into what they were. So we have in the 9th, the 10th, and the 11th centuries this golden age. That's the great intellectual achievements. But by the end of the 11th century, they're sort of starting to peter out. One reason is that the major trend among the Karaites in the land of Israel was mourning for Zion, Avelut Zion. Now, the idea of the mourning for Zion is if you adopt mourning for mourning with mourning, okay, practices, wearing sackcloth and not eating meat and not drinking wine and saying special prayers and denying yourself and living in not very nice houses. If you do that and pray for God long enough in the land of Israel, then the Messiah will come. Well, this had a lot of influence in the 10th century and a lot of followers, not only among Karaites. By the 11th century, we know that there are Karaite butchers in Jerusalem, which means that they were not all mourners of Zion. And after 100 years or so of 150 years of intense activity, it sort of started petering out. Then came the Seljuk invasion of the land of Israel, and then eventually in 1099 came the Crusaders, and the Crusaders gave the final blow to the Jewish communities there. And so I keep on seeing all these comments coming, so I lose my train of thought. So we'll get to the questions at the end. So both the rabbinic community and the Karaite community are devastated by the Crusaders. So let's go further on to the next stage. The next Karaite center is in the Byzantine Empire, which is now where Turkey is today, the major city being Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. And Karaites found a refuge from the land of Israel in Byzantium or Constantinople. But it's interesting, they had a lot of problems. First of all, I mentioned something about the calendar, and the calendar was based on observation. Again, I'll talk about this next week, but the phenomenon which are observed for making the calendar, especially for the leap year, are in the land of Israel. Now, if you're looking for the barley crop, which is what they did to make a leap year, and you find it, well, you can't exactly send an email from Jerusalem to Constantinople telling everybody there that they found the barley crop. It's one of the reasons why those people, those Jews, rabbinic Jews in the diaspora, observe 2 days of the holidays. Like just had Shavuot, you had a 3-day extravaganza. We in Israel had only 2 days, which is unusual for us. But the reason why there's a second day of the holidays in the diaspora is because of the lack of communication. But eventually, the calendar, the rabbinic calendar, became standardized and became a calculated calendar. But the Karaites used a observed calendar. So how are they going to make their holidays? How are they going to determine the calendar? And they had another problem, which is I won't say all, but most of the classics of Karaite literature were written in Arabic and Hebrew script. That's called Judeo-Arabic. It's like Yiddish, which is Judeo-German, or Judaismo Ladino, which is Judeo-Spanish. There's also Judeo-Arabic. And most of the classics were written in this language, in the Arabic and Hebrew script. Interestingly enough, just as a side note, Karaites were the only Jews who wrote Hebrew in Arabic letters. Jews were common to write Arabic and Hebrew letters, but only Karaites, including biblical texts, the Bible scripts, wrote it in the Hebrew language in Arabic script, which gives me another opportunity. The cover of my book is from one of these manuscripts. That's the book, part of the Exodus, which was written in the Hebrew language in Arabic. Anyway, getting back to Byzantium, everything's in Hebrew, everything's in Arabic. Well, perhaps the first immigrants from land of Israel to Byzantium knew Arabic, but I assume most of the people listening are 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 generations away from an immigrant to somewhere, and one knows how easily one forgets, or one's children forget, the language of the immigrants. So what the Karaites had to do was have a translation project and transfer all their classics from Arabic, Judeo-Arabic, into Hebrew. And so some of the first Arabic works, Jewish Arabic works translated into Hebrew, were done by Karaites. Now, it sounds good, except that this Hebrew is almost unreadable. And eventually the Karaites adopted more or less the Rabbinic translation Hebrew. Another thing that happens over the centuries in Byzantium is a rapprochement with the rest of the Jewish people and the rabbinic Jews. So in the 12th century, the Jewish traveler Benjamin of Tudela visited Constantinople and found that there was a wall between the Karaite section and the Jewish and the rabbinic section, the Rabbinite section. All right. By the 15th century, the most important Karaite leaders were studying with the most important Rabbinite leaders, so that the Karaites became closer and closer to the Rabbinites. And there's a great rapprochement, and they didn't give up their core beliefs or practices, but certainly the groups became closer. Anyway, another invasion, another capture, and this was the Ottomans who capture Constantinople in 1453. I don't know how much effect that has on Karaite creativity because they continued into the 16th century, but eventually the center of Karaite activity became Eastern Europe. A number of places in Eastern Europe. One is in the Crimea, and there are probably more Karaites than Rabbinites. The Rabbinites here are called Krimchaks. Never became a major center of Rabbinic Judaism. They're also in other what were called Volhynia and Galicia. All three of those, the Ukraine officially, but not de facto, and the other parts are Volhynia and Galicia are part of the Ukraine. So those cities are somewhat in the news today, but they had small Karaite communities, and the biggest Karaite community in Eastern Europe was in Lithuania. And the center was in what Jews called Troki, what now the Lithuanians call Trakai, also Vilnius, Vilna. And they were at first very much attached to the community in Constantinople. In fact, we have a letter they wrote from Lithuania to Constantinople, Istanbul of today, asking about the use of, about heating houses on the Shabbat. Now, presumably they weren't going to light the fire themselves, but they were probably going to do what Rabbinite Jews did, which was ask their non-Jewish neighbors to come in and keep the fires going. So they wrote to the authorities in Byzantium, and they got an answer which said, oh, how cold could it be there? You know, you can last a day without heating. Obviously, without any idea of what a winter in Vilna was like, Lithuania. And it's likely that over the years, they compromised on this issue. I mean, nature is pretty strong. During the early period, let's say the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, the Karaites in Eastern Europe, this was the Lithuanian Polish Commonwealth and Galicia, Volhynia, were part and parcel of the Jewish community. They paid their taxes with what was called the Vad Arba Aratzot, the Committee of the Four Lands. More tellingly, in 1648, Khmelnytsky revolt and the massacres, they were also slaughtered and murdered by Khmelnytsky as Jews. So they were part of the Jewish community. And then at the end of the 18th century, a very interesting thing happens. The area where most of the Karaites were living were captured or conquered by the Russians, the Austrians, and the Germans. This is the division of Poland in the 18th century. And suddenly, these countries, especially Russia, which had almost no Jews, suddenly they had large numbers of Jews. And the question the Russians asked is, what are we going to do with all these Jews? We don't want them. Some of you may be familiar with the idea that one Russian advisor told the Tsar, 1/3 to emigrate, 1/3 to convert, and 1/3 to murder. So the Russians, and first the Austrians and then the Russians, passed all kinds of laws to persecute the Jews. So the Karaites said to themselves, well, wait, we don't want this to apply to us. How about we go and convince the Russians, the Tsars? First it was the Empress Maria Theresa of Austria in 1774, but then the Tsars in 1795 and 1827. Why don't we convince the Tsars that we're a different type of Jew and we shouldn't have the same laws as these Rabbinite Jews? And especially in 1827, it was the draft law, those who know the 25-year draft and the Cantonists. So they convinced the Tsars, especially, that they were a different type of Jew. And this began the Karaite separation. Can't tell the whole story. The important character involved is Abraham Firkovich. Some of you may know the name. He was a book collector. He was a forger. He was a entrepreneur. He was a Karaite apologist. It's his collection of manuscripts in St. Petersburg, which is a very, very important source for all of Jewish history, especially Karaite history and literature. So Firkovich developed an idea that the Karaites were descendants either from Jews who had been exiled during the First Temple or descendants of the Khazars, the people that were converted in the 8th, 9th century, the book of Kuzari is based on. He didn't say they weren't Jews, but he said that they were a different type of Jews with different sort of background or origin. And then in the 20th century, the Karaites realized that it's not enough to be Jews with a different religion, because if you're racially Jews, you're going to be in big trouble. And this is the time of the racial anti-Semitism became scientific, so-called racial anti-Semitism, beginning of the 20th century. So one of their leaders, also an interesting fellow named Shraya Shapshal, convinced the Karaites to adopt the idea that they're not Jewish, they have nothing to do with Jews. They're a Turkic Jews, they come from Central Asia. And it's interesting, the Karaites, I didn't mention this, but the Karaites in Eastern Europe spoke a Turkic language, now called Karaim. It's almost disappeared, but they had their own Turkic language. And then they claimed that they're really not Jews, that they're from their Turkic tribe from Central Asia. They gave up on Hebrew, they gave up on circumcision, and they said there were nothing to do with the Jewish people. They were not racially Jewish. Well, comes the Shoah, the Nazis come, and as you know, they try to be scientific, so-called, and they investigate as to whether the Karaites were Jews. So they asked the Karaites, and the Karaites says, no, we're obviously not Jews. They asked the rabbis, a number of Polish rabbis, and said, are the Karaites Jews? And they understood that if they said yes, they would be signing their death certificate. So they said, no, they're not Jewish. And even though some Karaites were murdered as Jews during World War II, they survived. But they survived in a sense as not being Jewish and being cut off from the rest of the Jewish people. And now in Eastern Europe, they're very, very small numbers, a handful, maybe 1,000, 2,000, some in Crimea, some still in Lithuania. And they've lost almost all Jewish identity. Now, this isn't the end of the story. The whole time, all the places I was talking about, whether in the land of Israel or in Byzantium or in Eastern Europe, there were Karaites in Egypt. And we know they were very prominent there. They didn't write so much. They didn't leave many books behind, but we know that they were there, and we know that Maimonides knew them. And throughout the years, they were part of the Jewish community in Egypt. We have ketubot, marriage contracts from the Geniza, which are basically prenup agreements between a Karaite and a Rabbinite as to how they would, whose holidays they would follow and whose dietary laws they would follow and how they would respect each other's tradition. So they were intermarriage, they were part of the community. And so much so, even in the 20th century Egypt, some of you may know of the plot that Israel carried out in the early 1950s to try to sabotage American installations in Egypt to get the Americans to dislike the Egyptians, but it was unfortunately Jews were doing it. 2 Egyptian Jews were publicly executed for doing this. One was Dr. Moshe Marzuk, who was a Karaite. Anyway, as a result of this event and the Sinai campaign in 1956 and the Six-Day War in 1967, Egypt decided to get rid of most of the Jews they had, and or many of the Jews decided they shouldn't stay. And those Jews included many Karaites, most of whom ended up in the land of Israel and the state of Israel. So we have today is the major Karaite organization, or the population, is in Israel. The Universal Karaite Judaism Center is in Ramla. The other major Karaite city is Ashdod. In my own Beersheba, we have a Karaite synagogue. In fact, his former, I'm sure he will be again, Karaite chief rabbi, lives in Beersheba, wrote a PhD with me. And we have the Karaites trying to reconstruct their life and their community in Israel as the center. There's one other center for Karaite life, and that's in Bay Area in California, with a synagogue in Daly City, California. And there are small groups of Karaites in Lausanne, still in Istanbul today. Marseille has some. I see someone says there's a community in Istanbul. Yes, there's a community in Istanbul. But people always ask for numbers. Karaites tended to exaggerate them, but probably no more than 40,000 in Israel and maybe up to 10,000 in the rest of the world. So we're talking about a group which is not even a fraction of a percent of the Jewish world. Let me go look at the comments. I see the hour is winding down. I guess I should start from the beginning. Okay. So Lawrence Kaplan mentioned something about the books of commandments being scriptural, but Maimonides, Mishnah Torah, the rabbinic ones are based on the rabbinic explanation of the laws. Deb Schuback, yes or no to sacrifices? Since Karaism developed after the destruction of the temple, certainly they weren't offering sacrifices. They're not Samaritans. Samaritans are from my point of view, a non-Jewish group who are very, very marginal. They live in the northern part of it, well, in Shechem and Samaria, some in Cholon. They still have sacrifices, but Karaites do not have sacrifices. They have prayer, and I'll talk about the Karaite prayer next week. If you look at the advertisement for the series, you'll see a picture of the Karaite synagogue in Jerusalem, and you'll see what's unique about that. Were the Karaites excommunicated? There were times in which there were bans announced. Exactly when and where and how and what that meant is hard to tell. In the 12th century, Abraham ibn Daud in Spain wrote about a ceremony that every year was held on the Mount of Olives, in which the rabbis, the Gonim of the land of Israel, would excommunicate the Karaites, and they'd be sitting there like quiet sheep, accepting their fate. There's good reasons to doubt that story. It certainly wasn't every year. And even if they were excommunicated, that doesn't mean that they didn't get along with the rest of the Jewish community. We have a great letter from the 11th century from Ramla, and it's interesting, the center today now is in Ramla, and the center then was in Ramla, where the head of the community, the Rabbinic community, is writing to the Egyptian community. This is all from the Geniza, writing to the Rabbinic community in Geniza, asking for help. He's having a fight in the shul, and the Karaites say, if you don't do it our way, I'm sorry, not the Karaites, some of the members of the shul said, if you don't do it our way, we'll go to the Karaite synagogue. So obviously it was an open option. I mean, I guess the equivalent in America or North America is people wake up Saturday morning trying to decide whether to go to the Orthodox, the Reform, or the Conservative synagogue, or to the mall. So there they were trying to decide which synagogue they should go to, and they could easily go to Karaite or the Rabbinite synagogue. All right, in Rambam's time, who were more numerous, obviously the Rabbinites were. There are those who think that in the land of Israel in the 10th century, there are more Karaites than Rabbinites. There's no way of telling that, and it would appear that that's not the case. The problem is there's demography. It's hard enough nowadays to count who is a Jew and who is a Karaite Jew and who is a Rabbinite Jew. Certainly in the time, in the past, we had no way of knowing the numbers. Someone writes something that both may be correct about Saja Gaon. Excuse me, it's a little bit difficult for me to follow, but in terms of what I said about Saj's role of uniting energizing the Karaites, but he also increased pressure on them by his campaign at the same time. Yes, that's true. But the issue is, would the Karaites would Karaism have taken over Judaism if Saadia Gaon had not argued against them? Now, again, I mentioned the mourners of Zion. They didn't eat meat or drink wine, and they dressed in sackcloth. They spent a lot of their times reciting dirges. I mean, this is not a popular major movement. This is not going to attract most Jews to this type of lifestyle. Also, the Karaites, the early Karaites, still to a certain extent to this day, objected to many aspects of popular religion, such as magic and mysticism, a lot of things that the Amcha, that the people like. So it was really an intellectual movement in many respects. So to say that they would have taken over is a little bit different. Hard to believe that. Okay, someone asked about the difference between Sadukim, Perushim, and Karaites, Rabbinites. Okay, so the Perushim, the Pharisees, turned into Rabbinic Judaism, the Rabbinites. The rabbis were the successors of the Pharisees. The Sadducees was a Second Temple group that, as far as we know, disappeared with the destruction of the temple. The claim is that the Karaites were the underground Sadducees for 800 years. But the relationship might be through these texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Also, one has to distinguish between Sadducees, Tzedukim, and the Zadokites, or the sons of Tzadok, who appear in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Karaites who claim for themselves going to Tzadikim. Okay, someone says it'd be interesting to see why Karaites never gained as large numbers as a sustained basis as the Hasidim. Well, first of all, they weren't trying to change the law, the Hasidim. They also were more accepting people on popular religion, a lot more popular religion and mysticism and magic, and as there was in the Karaites. So it's not an intellectual movement as such. Okay, in Israel, whether rules about marriage of Karaites, does the rabbinate control it? Very good question. I hope to deal with that next week. So everybody come back. Am I able to share my email address? Well, Google me, they'll find it there. Okay, someone cited my book in the Book on Ibn Ezra. Thank you very much. Synagogue in the Old City of Jerusalem. The synagogue, that picture is in the Old City. It's a tribute to Anan. It was also an interesting phenomenon. The Karaites, when the Karaites adopted Anan as their pater ecclesiae, the father of their church, and again, only as a reinvigorator, not as an inventor, not as a schismatic. They then also made him into a mourner of Zion, and they said when he was let out of jail by the caliph, or if he was persecuted by the rabbis, he went to Israel and founded the Anan synagogue in Jerusalem. That synagogue is known as the Synagogue of Anan. It's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, continuous use synagogues in Jerusalem, but there's no connection to Anan. All right, someone says Karaites didn't have shlichim. I think someone's saying that they, unlike Chabad, they didn't have their own emissaries and missionaries, which is not true. In the 10th century, the Karaites did have missionaries. And in fact, some people say that very equivalent to the Shiites, that there's a term in Arabic for the Shiite missionaries, and the word in the Arabic word is for calling out. And likro, koreh, is also means to to call out. And therefore, some people think that it has nothing to do with mikra, it has to do with these missionaries. So there were Karaite missionaries in the 10th century, but don't think they were ever successful. Anyway, Maxine?
Thank you so much. That was a really wonderful overview, and I'm looking forward to hearing more in the next couple of weeks. Also, just to let everyone know what's going on here at Torah in Motion in the next couple of days. In half an hour, actually, Shuli Mishkin is starting a new series on the development of the synagogue in the land of Israel. Tonight, Parshat Shavua is being taught by Liora Moskowitz, a current student at GPATS. Tomorrow, Rabbi Kelman's class on the Siddur is continuing, and on Sunday at the usual time, 11:15 a.m. Eastern, Rabbi Menachem Leibtag is starting a new series on the generation that left Egypt. So, and then more to come next week as well. Looking forward to seeing you next week at this class or before then. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. See you next week.
See you.